Marcus Chun had always been invisible. In the sprawling research facility on Europa Station, he moved through the corridors like a ghost among titans. While his colleagues debated theoretical physics in booming voices and gesticulated wildly during presentations, Marcus kept his head down, spoke only when spoken to, and submitted his reports through digital channels rather than grand announcements. The Kethvar Empire had conquered 17 star systems in the past decade, each victory adding another layer to their reputation as the galaxy's most sophisticated military force. Their ships moved like silver daggers through space, their weapons could crack planets, and their intelligence network stretched across half the known galaxy. They ruled through a combination of overwhelming technological superiority and careful political manipulation, turning species against each other while positioning themselves as the inevitable victors. To most observers, humanity was just another species waiting for absorption into the Empire. Earth's colonies scattered across 12 systems seemed insignificant compared to the Kethvar war machine. The aliens had already begun their standard protocol: economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and the gradual insertion of advisors into human government structures. Dr. Sarah Morrison, the station's chief xenobiologist, often forgot Marcus even worked in her department. He occupied a small office at the end of a forgotten corridor, officially tasked with analyzing communication patterns and alien technologies recovered from various conflicts. It was considered busy work, the kind of assignment given to researchers who showed promise but lacked the personality for advancement. What none of them knew was that Marcus had been conducting his own private war for 3 years. It started when he noticed something odd in the Kethvar communication intercepts. The Empire prided itself on using quantum-encrypted channels that shifted frequencies billions of times per second, making eavesdropping theoretically impossible. But Marcus had always been good at seeing patterns others missed. As a child, he could solve puzzles that stumped adults. As a student, he found mathematical relationships that his professors insisted didn't exist until he proved them wrong. The Kethvar encryption wasn't random. Buried beneath layers of quantum noise and frequency jumping, there was a rhythm, a pattern so subtle that even their own people probably didn't notice it. It took Marcus 18 months to map it completely, working 16-hour days while his colleagues assumed he was struggling with basic analysis. Once he understood the pattern, Marcus could read their communications like morning headlines. He learned about fleet movements weeks before they happened, discovered the locations of hidden supply bases, and began to understand the internal politics of an empire that presented a united face to the galaxy. The Kethvar weren't as unified as they appeared. The empire consisted of 3 major factions constantly maneuvering for advantage. The military council believed in direct conquest and rule through strength. The science directorate preferred subtle manipulation and technological dominance. The administrative branch focused on economic control and bureaucratic efficiency. For months, Marcus simply observed and learned. He discovered that Admiral Zethkri of the Military Council had been conducting unauthorized raids against science director installations. Director Vashtel of the Science Branch had been secretly developing weapons that violated interstellar treaties, weapons she hadn't shared with her supposed allies. Administrator Quellen A.S. had been siphoning resources from military budgets to fund his own expansion projects. The 3 factions tolerated each other because they needed the combined strength to maintain their empire. But Marcus began to see the cracks in that foundation. His first move was subtle. He identified a military council supply convoy carrying experimental weapons to a border system. Using carefully crafted anonymous tips sent through untraceable channels, he ensured that Science Directorate patrols would intercept the convoy at exactly the right moment. When Directorate forces discovered weapons they hadn't authorized, weapons that could threaten their own installations, the political fallout was immediate. Director Vashtel accused Admiral Zethkri of planning a coup. The admiral responded by claiming the Science Directorate was developing planet killers in secret. Within days, both factions were conducting defensive investigations of each other's facilities. Marcus watched the intelligence reports flow through his monitoring station, tracking the growing paranoia between the two factions. Neither side suspected external interference. The evidence looked completely authentic because it was authentic. Marcus had simply arranged for them to discover truths they had been hiding from each other. His second operation was more complex. Marcus had identified a joint science administrative project developing new surveillance technologies for occupied worlds. The project required materials that could only be obtained through military council supply chains. By carefully timing the release of information about Administrator Quellenas's budget manipulations, Marcus ensured that Admiral Zethkri would discover the embezzlement just as the military council was being asked to provide expensive materials for a project they knew nothing about. The resulting confrontation played out across encrypted channels that Marcus monitored in real time. Administrator Quellenas accused the military council of trying to sabotage peaceful governance projects. Admiral Zethkri demanded explanations for why military resources were being used for surveillance systems that could monitor military personnel. Director Vashtel found herself caught between two angry allies, each demanding that she choose sides. To his colleagues on Europa Station, Marcus appeared to be struggling with his assigned work. He submitted reports late, spoke even less than usual, and seemed perpetually distracted during meetings. Dr. Morrison considered reassigning him to less demanding duties, assuming the pressure of analyzing alien technologies was overwhelming him. In reality, Marcus was orchestrating the systematic destruction of the most powerful empire in the galaxy. His third operation targeted the Empire's expansion into the Helix sector, where human colonies were producing food for most of the Outer Rim. The Kethvar had been applying economic pressure, offering protection services at prices designed to bankrupt local governments. Once the colonies defaulted on payments, the Empire would move in as humanitarian administrators and assume permanent control. Marcus identified the key figure in this operation, Sector Administrator Melhaz, who had successfully absorbed 14 systems using identical tactics. Melhaz was ambitious, efficient, and completely loyal to Administrator Quellenas. He was also skimming 30% of the tribute payments and using the money to build his own private fleet. The beauty of Marcus's plan was its simplicity. He arranged for Director Vashtel to intercept communications detailing Melhaz's embezzlement and fleet-building activities. But instead of sending the information directly to the Science Directorate, Marcus made sure it would appear to come from Admiral Zethkri's intelligence network. The implications were explosive. If the military council had evidence of administrative branch corruption and was sharing it with the Science Directorate, it suggested an alliance between the two most powerful factions against the third. Administrator Quellenas would be forced to assume that his two rivals were coordinating against him. Within hours of receiving the information, Director Vashtel was demanding explanations from Administrator Quellenas about unauthorized military buildups in administrative sectors. She claimed the military council had brought her evidence of concerning developments that threatened the stability of the Empire. Administrator Quellenas's response was swift and decisive. He ordered Sector Administrator Melhaz to investigate possible Science Directorate spies within his organization while simultaneously demanding that Admiral Zethkri explain why military intelligence was being shared with rival factions. The three-way accusations that followed created exactly the paralysis Marcus had been hoping for. Each faction began investigating the others while defending themselves from multiple attacks. Resources that should have been devoted to the conquest of human colonies were instead directed toward internal security and counterintelligence operations. Marcus expanded his monitoring networks, tracking every communication between the three factions. He learned their individual codes, their personal grudges, and their deepest fears. Admiral Zethkri feared being replaced by younger officers who questioned his aggressive tactics. Director Vashtel worried that her scientific achievements were being weaponized beyond her control. Administrator Quellenas was terrified that his administrative empire would be dissolved by military conquest or scientific revolution. Using this knowledge, Marcus began crafting more sophisticated operations. He identified joint projects between factions and systematically sabotaged them by ensuring that each group discovered the others were withholding crucial information. He found personal communications between faction leaders and arranged for them to be misinterpreted as evidence of betrayal. The most successful operation involved a new class of HFY battleships being developed jointly by all three factions. The Military Council provided tactical requirements, the Science Directorate developed the technology, and the Administrative Branch managed resources and production. Marcus discovered that each faction had been secretly modifying the ship designs for their own advantage. The Military Council wanted weapons that could target Science Directorate installations. The Science Directorate had built-in remote shutdown capabilities that could disable the ships if they were ever used against scientific facilities. The Administrative Branch had installed monitoring systems that would give them complete intelligence on ship operations and crew activities. Rather than exposing these modifications immediately, Marcus waited until the first squadron of new battleships was completed and deployed to a border system. Then, he arranged for each faction to discover the other's secret modifications simultaneously. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Admiral Zeth Kree accused the Science Directorate of sabotaging military vessels and demanded the immediate recall of all ships for inspection. Director Vashtel claimed the Military Council was preparing to use the new ships for a coup and began developing countermeasures. Administrator Quellen A.S. declared that both factions had compromised the security of the entire fleet and ordered a complete halt to the battleship program. Within days, the HFY's most advanced military project had been suspended indefinitely while the three factions conducted investigations of each other. The border system where the ships had been deployed became a standoff zone, with each faction sending its own ships to monitor the others. Marcus watched the chaos unfold from his small office on Europa Station, surrounded by the gentle hum of monitoring equipment that his colleagues assumed was analyzing routine communications. In reality, he was tracking the systematic collapse of the galaxy's most feared empire, one carefully orchestrated revelation at a time. The beautiful irony was that Marcus wasn't creating any false information. Every piece of evidence he revealed was completely authentic. The corruption, the unauthorized projects, the personal betrayals, they were all real. The HFY had been rotting from within for years, held together only by external pressure and the appearance of unity. Marcus was simply providing each faction with truthful information about what their allies were really doing. The Empire's destruction was entirely self-inflicted, triggered by the revelation of truths they had been hiding from each other. As reports of increased HFY fleet movements filled the daily briefings, Dr. Morrison noticed that Marcus seemed more alert and focused than he had in months. She assumed he was finally finding his rhythm with the alien communication analysis work. If she had looked more closely at his computer screens, she would have seen something remarkable. Real-time intelligence on the most classified operations of the galaxy's most secretive empire, all flowing through monitoring networks that shouldn't have been able to penetrate HFY encryption. But Dr. Morrison, like everyone else, saw only what she expected to see. A quiet researcher struggling with routine assignments while more dramatic events unfolded across the galaxy. They had no idea that the shy analyst in the Forgotten Office was orchestrating the greatest intelligence operation in human history, one that would soon bring the HFY empire to its knees. Marcus saved his files and prepared to begin the next phase of his private war. The HFY thought they were facing internal political difficulties that would resolve themselves once proper authority was restored. They had no idea that their problems were just beginning and that the quiet human they would never notice was about to escalate his campaign against their empire. 6 months after Marcus began his intelligence war, the HFY empire was experiencing what their own analysts called unprecedented internal coordination difficulties. What they didn't realize was that their quiet human enemy had moved from simple sabotage to active psychological warfare. Marcus had spent weeks studying the personal histories of the three faction leaders, learning their fears ambitions, and psychological weaknesses. Admiral Zeth Kree had risen to power by exposing a conspiracy against the previous military commander, making him perpetually paranoid about betrayal. Director Vashtel had lost her research mentor to a political purge years earlier, leaving her determined to protect scientific independence at any cost. Administrator Quellen A.S. had built his career by absorbing smaller administrative rivals, making him hypersensitive to any threat to his bureaucratic territory. Understanding these personalities, Marcus designed operations that would trigger maximum psychological damage while maintaining complete deniability. His weapons weren't explosives or viruses. They were truth, timing, and the inherent instability of any alliance built on mutual mistrust. The first target was Admiral Zeth Kree's flagship, the Devastator, pride of the Kethvar battle fleet. Marcus had discovered that the ship's construction had involved components from all three factions, with each group contributing different systems. More importantly, he learned that Director Vashtel had secretly installed experimental sensors throughout the ship to study combat effectiveness, while Administrator Quellen A.S. had placed monitoring devices to track military resource usage. Marcus arranged for Admiral Zeth Kree to discover both surveillance networks simultaneously, but from sources that made it appear as if the Science Directorate and Administrative Branch were coordinating their intelligence gathering. The evidence was presented through what appeared to be a whistleblower in the ship's engineering crew, actually a carefully crafted digital identity that Marcus had been building for months. The Admiral's reaction exceeded Marcus's expectations. Zeth Kree didn't just demand explanations from the other factions. He ordered his personal guard to conduct a complete security sweep of the entire military fleet. When they found similar monitoring systems on other ships, the Admiral became convinced that his rivals were preparing for a coordinated assault on military leadership. Director Vashtel received demands for immediate explanations about unauthorized surveillance equipment, accusations that the Science Directorate was violating military autonomy agreements. Her response was to point out that the administrative branch had installed even more monitoring systems, suggesting that any coordination was between the military and administrative factions against the scientists. Administrator Quellen A.S. found himself accused by both other factions of conducting unauthorized surveillance, which he countered by revealing that he had evidence of secret meetings between military and scientific personnel. The meetings had actually been routine technical consultations, but, taken out of context, they appeared to support his claims of conspiracy. Within a week, all three factions had stopped sharing intelligence with each other and begun conducting independent security investigations. The paralysis that resulted allowed human colonies in the Helix sector to reject Kethvar protection offers without facing immediate retaliation. Marcus's success in fragmenting the Empire's leadership gave him the confidence to attempt more ambitious operations. He identified a joint military scientific facility called the Deep Research Station, located in an isolated system where the Kethvar were developing new conquest technologies. The station represented the kind of cooperation between factions that the Empire needed to maintain its technological superiority. Marcus discovered that the station was developing three separate projects: quantum disruptor weapons that could disable any known shield technology, biological agents designed to pacify resistant populations, and economic warfare systems that could remotely manipulate planetary financial networks. Each project was a closely guarded secret from the other factions, despite being developed in the same facility. The breakthrough came when Marcus realized that one of the station's communication officers was sending personal messages to a lover on the Kethvar homeworld. The messages used an obsolete encryption system that Marcus had cracked months earlier, and they contained detailed complaints about the stress of working at a facility where everyone is spying on everyone else. Using information from these personal communications, Marcus learned the complete personnel structure of the Deep Research Station, including which scientists reported to which faction leaders and who had access to which projects. More importantly, he discovered that the station commander, General Voxtar, had been reporting different information to each faction about project progress and resource requirements. Marcus crafted an operation that would expose General Voxstar's deceptions while making it appear that each faction was deliberately sabotaging the other's research. He arranged for Director Vashtel to receive detailed reports about how Administrator Quellen AS was redirecting resources meant for quantum disruptor development toward biological weapons research. Simultaneously, Administrator Quellen AS received evidence that Admiral Zeth Kree was planning to test quantum weapons against Science Director installations. The beauty of the operation was that all the evidence was technically true. Resources were being moved between projects, and the military council did have contingency plans for using new weapons against rival factions. Marcus was simply ensuring that each faction learned about activities that had been hidden from them. General Voxstar found himself facing simultaneous investigations from all three factions, each convinced that he was collaborating with their rivals against them. When he tried to explain that resource sharing was necessary for efficient research, each faction interpreted his explanations as evidence that he was prioritizing other groups' projects over theirs. The result was the complete shutdown of the Deep Research Station. Rather than allow their rivals to benefit from research they couldn't control, each faction withdrew their personnel and resources. Within months, the Empire's most advanced research facility was abandoned, its cutting-edge projects terminated before completion. Marcus expanded his operations to target the Empire's economic networks, which Administrator Quellen AS used to maintain control over conquered systems. The Kethvar economy depended on tribute payments from subject worlds, trade monopolies that funneled profits to the homeworld, and currency manipulation that kept other species economically dependent on imperial systems. By carefully timing the release of information about economic policies, Marcus triggered conflicts between the administrative branch and local system governors who had been skimming profits while maintaining plausible loyalty to the Empire. He revealed that Governor Heslin of the Proxima Industrial Complex had been charging unauthorized fees to human merchants while reporting to Administrator Quellen AS that trade revenues were declining due to human resistance. The revelation led to a confrontation between Administrator Quellen AS and Governor Heslin that played out across encrypted channels Marcus monitored in real time. The governor accused the administrative branch of setting impossible economic targets while providing insufficient resources for enforcement. Administrator Quellen AS demanded explanations for missing revenue while questioning whether the governor was competent to manage human territories. Marcus escalated the conflict by ensuring that Director Vashtel received intelligence suggesting that Governor Heslin was secretly negotiating with human industrial leaders to provide advanced technology in exchange for higher tribute payments. The director interpreted this as evidence that the administrative branch was compromising scientific security for short-term economic gains. When Admiral Zeth Kree learned about the technology transfer negotiations, he assumed they were part of a science administrative alliance designed to give civilian factions control over military technologies. His response was to order military inspection teams to all administrative facilities in human territory, ostensibly to ensure security compliance. The resulting chaos allowed human colonies throughout the Empire to reduce their tribute payments while imperial factions fought over who had authority to collect them. Marcus watched economic reports showing declining imperial revenues, while political communications revealed increasing desperation among faction leaders trying to maintain their power bases. His most sophisticated operation targeted the Empire's intelligence networks, which all three factions used to monitor each other, as well as external threats. The Kethvar Intelligence Service was theoretically neutral, reporting to all faction leaders equally, but Marcus discovered that individual intelligence officers were secretly loyal to specific factions and often withheld information from rivals. Marcus identified Agent Kesthara, a highly placed intelligence officer who had been providing exclusive reports to Director Vashtel about administrative branch activities. Rather than exposing the agent directly, Marcus arranged for Admiral Zeth Kree to intercept communications that made it appear as if Agent Kesthara was a double agent working for both the Science Directorate and a human resistance movement. The evidence was carefully crafted to suggest that Agent Kestera had been feeding information about military council plans to human colonies, allowing them to avoid Imperial patrols and maintain independent communication networks. Marcus included authentic intelligence reports that had been slightly modified to appear as if they were being shared with human forces. Admiral Zethkree's investigation of Agent Kestera revealed the intelligence officer's actual relationship with Director Vashtel, which the Admiral interpreted as confirmation of science-human collaboration. The Director's attempts to protect her intelligence asset only reinforced the Admiral's suspicions that the Science Directorate was compromising Imperial security for their own purposes. The paranoia spread throughout the intelligence service as officers began investigating each other for signs of disloyalty. Within months, the Empire's intelligence-gathering capabilities had been severely degraded as agents spent more time watching their colleagues than monitoring external threats. Marcus realized that his operations were approaching a critical threshold. The Kethvar Empire was still powerful enough to destroy human civilization if the three factions managed to reunite against a common enemy. He needed to ensure that their internal conflicts would continue escalating rather than reaching a resolution. He identified private communications where each leader had expressed doubts about the other's loyalty, then arranged for those communications to be discovered by their intended targets. More devastatingly, he found instances where each leader had privately criticized their allies to subordinates, then ensured those criticisms reached the people being criticized. The psychological impact was devastating. Admiral Zethkree learned that Director Vashtel had described him as a relic from a more primitive era, who couldn't understand modern warfare. Director Vashtel discovered that Administrator Quellenais had called her dangerously naive about political realities. Administrator Quellenais found out that Admiral Zethkree considered him a parasite who produces nothing but paperwork. These revelations destroyed the personal trust that had held the Empire together through previous crises. Each leader concluded that their former allies had never respected them and were actively working to undermine their authority. Back on Europa Station, Dr. Morrison finally noticed that Marcus had become remarkably productive. His reports on alien communication patterns were detailed, insightful, and consistently ahead of schedule. She assumed he had finally adjusted to the demands of xenolinguistic analysis and began considering him for promotion to a more visible research position. Marcus politely declined the offer, explaining that he preferred the quiet independence of his current assignment. Dr. Morrison respected his preference for solitary work, unaware that her most invisible researcher was conducting the most successful intelligence operation in human history from his small, forgotten office. As reports of Kethvar internal restructuring filled the daily briefings, Marcus prepared for the final phase of his campaign. The Empire was fragmenting, but it remained dangerous. He needed to ensure that when the Kethvar collapsed, they would be too busy fighting each other to threaten humanity ever again. 1 year after Marcus began his campaign, the Kethvar Empire was hemorrhaging resources and authority across 17 star systems. What had started as minor coordination difficulties between factions had evolved into open hostility, with each group actively sabotaging the other's operations. But Marcus knew that wounded predators were often the most dangerous, and the Empire's fragmentation could still result in devastating attacks against human colonies if he couldn't control the direction of their collapse. The breakthrough came when Marcus discovered something remarkable in the deepest layers of Kethvar military communications. Admiral Zethkree was planning a coup. The Admiral had concluded that the Empire's problems stemmed from the three-faction system itself, and was secretly building support among military commanders for a return to direct military rule. The plan involved simultaneous arrests of rival faction leaders and the installation of military governors throughout Imperial territory. Marcus realized that a successful military coup would actually strengthen the Empire by eliminating internal conflicts and unifying command structure. More dangerously, a military dictatorship would likely blame external enemies for the Empire's recent troubles and launch aggressive expansion campaigns to restore imperial prestige. Instead of trying to stop the coup, Marcus decided to ensure it would fail in the most catastrophic way possible. His plan required precise timing and a deep understanding of the psychological profiles he had been building for months. The first element involved Admiral Zethkree's most trusted subordinate, General Thekros, who commanded the elite 5th Strike Fleet. Marcus had discovered that General Thekros harbored his own ambitions for supreme command and had been quietly documenting what he saw as the Admiral's strategic mistakes. More importantly, the general believed that Admiral Zethkree was too focused on internal politics and not aggressive enough in dealing with human resistance. Marcus arranged for General Thekros to intercept communications suggesting that Admiral Zethkree was planning to negotiate a peaceful settlement with human colonies after establishing military control over the Empire. The evidence was carefully crafted from actual diplomatic protocols that the Admiral had reviewed, presented in a context that made them appear as if Zethkree was preparing to abandon the military expansion that General Thekros believed was essential. Simultaneously, Marcus ensured that Admiral Zethkree would discover General Thekros's private criticism reports, but presented them as evidence that the general was coordinating with Director Vashtel to undermine military unity. The timing was crucial. Each revelation occurred just as both officers were finalizing their roles in the upcoming coup attempt. The psychological impact was immediate. Admiral Zethkree began questioning whether General Thekros could be trusted with a crucial role in seizing control of the Empire. General Thekros concluded that Admiral Zethkree was a weak leader who would compromise military victory for political convenience. While the military council's leadership structure crumbled from within, Marcus launched simultaneous operations against the other factions. He had identified Director Vashtel's secret project, the development of consciousness transfer technology that would allow Kethvar minds to survive in artificial bodies. The project represented the Science Directorate's ultimate insurance policy against political or military threats. Marcus discovered that the consciousness transfer research was being conducted at 3 separate facilities, with each location working on different aspects of the technology. The facilities were hidden from other factions and even from most Science Directorate personnel, but their communication networks were vulnerable to the monitoring systems Marcus had established. The brilliant aspect of Director Vashtel's project was that it could potentially make the Science Directorate immortal and therefore permanently dominant within the Empire. But the technology required massive computational resources that could only be obtained by secretly diverting power from military installations and administrative facilities. Marcus arranged for both Admiral Zethkree and Administrator Quellen AS to discover the consciousness transfer project simultaneously, but each learned about it through sources that suggested the other faction was involved. The Admiral received evidence indicating that Administrator Quellen AS had been providing funding for the research in exchange for guaranteed immortality for administrative leadership. Administrator Quellen AS learned about the project through reports suggesting that military computers were being used for consciousness transfer experiments. The revelations created a 3-way crisis that went beyond political rivalry into existential terror. Admiral Zethkree realized that Director Vashtel could potentially transfer the consciousness of rival faction leaders into controlled artificial bodies, making them immortal prisoners. Administrator Quellen AS understood that immortal scientists could accumulate infinite knowledge and power over time, eventually making administrative functions irrelevant. Director Vashtel found herself facing accusations of planning to enslave or eliminate her political rivals while creating a permanent scientific aristocracy. Her attempts to explain that the consciousness transfer technology was meant as a safeguard against external threats only reinforced suspicions that she considered other factions to be enemies rather than allies. Marcus escalated the crisis by revealing that each faction had been developing contingency plans against the others. The military council had designed weapons specifically for use against Science Director installations. The Science Directorate had created biological agents that could target the genetic markers common among administrative branch personnel. The administrative branch had developed economic warfare protocols that could crash the financial systems of military and scientific facilities. None of these revelations were fabricated. Each faction had indeed been developing secret weapons against their rivals, justifying them as defensive measures while keeping them hidden to maintain the appearance of imperial unity. Marcus simply ensured that everyone learned about everyone else's preparations simultaneously. The psychological impact was devastating. Each faction leader realized that their supposed allies had been preparing to destroy them while pretending loyalty to the Empire. The discovery that decades of cooperation had been built on a foundation of mutual planning for betrayal shattered any remaining trust between the three groups. Admiral Zethkree accelerated his coup plans, but now included provisions for immediately neutralizing both consciousness transfer technology and economic warfare systems. General Thekros began planning his own coup against the Admiral, convinced that Zethkree was too compromised by political thinking to properly address the threats from rival factions. Director Vashtel activated emergency protocols to protect her research facilities, interpreting the military preparations as evidence of an imminent attack. Administrator Quellen AS began implementing economic sanctions against both military and scientific operations, cutting off funding and resources needed for their anti-administrative weapons development. Marcus watched the three-way acceleration toward conflict with careful attention to timing. The Empire was approaching a point where each faction would move against the others simultaneously, creating maximum chaos. But he needed to ensure that when the collapse came, it would be permanent rather than temporary. The solution involved the Empire's most closely guarded secret, the location of the Kethvar homeworld. Throughout their expansion, the Empire had maintained strict security around their point of origin, ensuring that conquered species could never threaten their population center. Even within the Imperial government, only the highest-ranking officials knew the exact coordinates of the homeworld system. Marcus had spent months analyzing communication patterns, supply routes, and personnel transfers to narrow down the homeworld's location. The breakthrough came when he identified a pattern in medical supply shipments that could only make sense if they were being sent to a specific star system that appeared uninhabited on all official charts. Once Marcus confirmed the homeworld location, he faced a crucial decision. He could reveal the coordinates to human military forces, giving humanity the ultimate weapon against the Empire. But a direct attack on the Kethvar homeworld would unite all three factions against the external threat, potentially restoring Imperial unity just when it was on the verge of collapse. Instead, Marcus decided to use the homeworld location as the final catalyst for factional warfare. He arranged for each faction to discover that the others had been secretly moving resources and personnel to hidden facilities near the homeworld system. The evidence suggested that each group was preparing to seize direct control of the population center while eliminating their rivals. Admiral Zethkree learned that Director Vashtel had been transferring consciousness research equipment to a facility within the homeworld system, apparently preparing to offer immortality to the civilian population in exchange for political support. General Thekros discovered that Administrator Quellen AS had been establishing economic control networks around the homeworld, positioning himself to control all trade and resource distribution. Director Vashtel found evidence that Admiral Zethkree had been secretly deploying military forces to hidden bases throughout the homeworld system, apparently preparing to impose martial law. Administrator Quellen AS learned that General Thekros had been conducting unauthorized recruitment among homeworld civilian populations. Each revelation appeared to confirm the others' worst fears about their rivals' ultimate intentions. The homeworld represented the heart of Kethvar civilization, the one thing that all three factions were sworn to protect above all else. Evidence that each group was secretly maneuvering to control or threaten the homeworld transformed political rivalry into a desperate struggle for species survival. Marcus carefully timed the release of information so that all three factions would learn about their rivals' activities simultaneously, just as Admiral Zethkree's coup was scheduled to begin. The result was exactly what he had planned. Instead of a coordinated military takeover followed by potential attacks against human colonies, the Empire exploded into immediate three-way civil war. Admiral Zethkree moved against both rival factions at once, convinced that they were preparing to hold the homeworld hostage. General Thekros launched his own coup against the Admiral while simultaneously trying to secure military control over homeworld defense systems. Director Vashtel activated all her secret weapons against both military factions, believing they were planning to destroy consciousness research and eliminate scientific leadership. Administrator Quelnas implemented total economic warfare protocols, cutting off resources and communications to both military and scientific operations. The fighting spread across 17 star systems as local commanders and administrators were forced to choose sides in a conflict that had no clear objectives beyond mutual destruction. Imperial fleets that had been preparing to attack human colonies instead turned their weapons against each other, while occupation forces withdrew from conquered systems to participate in the civil war. Marcus monitored the chaos from his quiet office on Europa Station, tracking communication patterns as the Kethvar Empire tore itself apart. The three-way civil war was spreading faster than any of the faction leaders had anticipated, as local commanders made independent decisions about which group to support based on incomplete information and personal grudges. Within weeks, the galactic balance of power had shifted completely. The Kethvar Empire, which had seemed unstoppable just months earlier, was now fragmenting into dozens of independent factions as local leaders declared independence from all three major groups. Human colonies throughout the Empire were declaring their freedom, while Imperial forces were too busy fighting each other to respond. Dr. Morrison noticed that Marcus seemed remarkably calm despite the galactic crisis unfolding around them. She assumed his quiet confidence came from his work analyzing alien communication patterns, which was probably providing valuable intelligence about the Kethvar collapse. If she had realized that her most invisible researcher was the architect of the entire crisis, she would have struggled to believe it. Marcus began preparing for the aftermath of Imperial collapse, knowing that the end of Kethvar dominance would create opportunities for other hostile species to threaten humanity. His methods had proven effective against one empire. They could be adapted to address future threats. The quiet human who had brought down the galaxy's greatest power was ready to defend his species against whatever came next. 18 months after Marcus Chan began his private war, the Kethvar Empire ceased to exist. What had once been 17 conquered star systems under unified control had fragmented into 47 independent factions, most of which were actively fighting each other for control of resources, territory, and the remnants of Imperial technology. The final collapse came when fighting reached the homeworld system itself. Admiral Zethkree's forces attempted to establish military control over the civilian population, while General Thekros's breakaway fleet attacked both Imperial installations and the Admiral's ships. Director Vashtel activated experimental weapons that accidentally damaged the homeworld's primary communications satellite, severing connections between the central government and outer systems. Administrator Quelnas's economic warfare protocols crashed the Imperial banking system, making it impossible to pay military personnel or purchase essential supplies. Within days, the Kethvar homeworld had descended into chaos as three separate military forces fought for control, while civilian authorities declared independence from all of them. Local system governors throughout the former empire found themselves cut off from central command and forced to make independent decisions about their territory's future. Marcus watched the final stages of imperial dissolution from Europa Station, monitoring communications as former Kethvar officials negotiated surrender terms with human colonies they had once ruled. The transformation was remarkable. Species that had been subjects of the Empire were now dictating terms to their former conquerors, demanding reparations, and establishing their own defense agreements. But Marcus knew his work was far from finished. The power vacuum left by the HFY collapse was already attracting attention from other hostile species. The Zephyrian hegemony, which controlled 12 systems along the galactic rim, had begun expanding into former Imperial territory. The Silicon Collective, a network of artificial intelligences that ruled 3 heavily industrialized systems, was offering protection contracts to species formerly protected by Imperial guarantees. More concerning was the emergence of new threats from within the wreckage of the Empire itself. Some HFY factions had survived the Civil War by adapting quickly to changed circumstances, abandoning the 3-faction system in favor of more flexible organizational structures. These neo-imperial groups were smaller than the original empire, but potentially more dangerous because they had learned from the mistakes that led to the collapse. Marcus identified 3 major neo-imperial factions that posed significant threats to human security. The Steel Command, led by former General Thekros, controlled 6 systems and maintained the most advanced military technology from the original empire. The Knowledge Syndicate, formed from survivors of Director Vashtel's Science Directorate, had preserved crucial research facilities and was developing new weapons technologies. The Economic Union, built from Administrator Quellen A.S.'s former network, controlled trade routes that could be used to strangle human colonies through resource manipulation. Each of these new factions had studied the original empire's collapse and implemented safeguards against the kind of intelligence operations Marcus had conducted. They used simpler communication protocols that were harder to intercept, maintained smaller leadership circles that were less vulnerable to internal conflicts, and focused on single objectives rather than trying to manage complex multi-faction cooperation. Marcus realized he needed to evolve his methods to address these new threats. The psychological warfare techniques that had worked against the Empire's 3-faction system wouldn't be as effective against more streamlined organizations. But the collapse of the Empire had given him new advantages: access to Imperial technology and communication systems, detailed knowledge of HFY psychology and tactics, and a network of monitoring stations that now covered most of the former Imperial territory. His first target was the Steel Command, which had begun making aggressive moves toward human colonies in the Outer Rim systems. General Thekros had learned from Admiral Zethkri's mistakes and maintained strict unity within his military organization. But Marcus had identified a crucial weakness: the general's obsession with proving that his strategic philosophy was superior to his former commander's approach. Marcus discovered that General Thekros was secretly developing what he called the perfect campaign, a military strategy that would allow the Steel Command to conquer human territory without the political complications that had weakened the original empire. The general had been studying human military tactics and social structures, looking for weaknesses that could be exploited for rapid conquest. The irony was perfect. General Thekros was planning to succeed where the Empire had failed by avoiding the internal conflicts that Marcus had orchestrated. But the general's need to prove his superiority over his former superiors created a different kind of vulnerability. Marcus began feeding the Steel Command intelligence about human defensive preparations, but the information was carefully selected to reinforce General Thekros's existing strategic biases. The general believed that humans were militarily inferior but politically unified, so Marcus provided evidence of human military weakness while hiding information about internal disagreements between human colonies. At the same time, Marcus ensured that human military commanders received accurate intelligence about Steel Command preparations, giving them the information they needed to prepare effective defenses. The result was a series of battles where General Thekros's forces achieved initial success against apparently weak human defenses, only to encounter unexpectedly strong resistance that his intelligence had failed to predict. Each tactical failure reinforced General Thekros's belief that his intelligence networks were being compromised by remnants of the old Imperial system. The general began conducting internal purges to eliminate suspected spies and traitors, weakening his own organization while becoming increasingly isolated from accurate information about human capabilities. Marcus's operation against the Knowledge Syndicate required a more sophisticated approach. The scientists who had survived the Empire's collapse were naturally suspicious and methodical, carefully verifying information before acting on it. But they had inherited Director Vashtel's obsession with scientific advancement and her belief that technological superiority could overcome any political or military challenge. Marcus discovered that the Knowledge Syndicate was developing something called Project Transcendence, an upgraded version of the consciousness transfer technology that had contributed to the Empire's downfall. The new project aimed to create hybrid organic artificial intelligences that would be immune to the psychological manipulation that had destroyed the original faction system. The scientists believed they could create perfect leaders by combining organic creativity with artificial logic and immunity to emotional manipulation. What they didn't realize was that their own obsession with technological solutions made them vulnerable to a different kind of psychological operation. Marcus began planting information suggesting that human colonies were developing their own advanced artificial intelligence systems with military applications. The evidence was technically accurate. Human research facilities were working on AI projects, but Marcus presented it in a context that made the research appear more advanced and threatening than it actually was. The Knowledge Syndicate's response was exactly what Marcus had anticipated. Instead of treating human AI development as a potential threat requiring diplomatic attention, they saw it as a technological challenge that required immediate scientific response. The Syndicate accelerated Project Transcendence while beginning development of countermeasures against human artificial intelligence. The rush to complete advanced research projects led to exactly the kind of mistakes that Marcus had been hoping for. Safety protocols were abbreviated, testing phases were compressed, and cooperation between different research teams was sacrificed for speed. Within months, the Knowledge Syndicate was experiencing the same kind of catastrophic technical failures that had plagued Director Vashtel's final projects. Marcus's most complex operation targeted the Economic Union, which posed the greatest long-term threat to human independence. The Union had learned from Administrator Quellenas's mistakes and avoided direct political or military confrontation, instead focusing on economic pressure that could gradually strangle human colonies without triggering military responses. The Union strategy was brilliantly simple: offer essential goods and services at prices below what human colonies could produce locally, creating economic dependence that would eventually lead to political control. Once human industries collapsed and populations became dependent on Union trade, economic pressure could be used to force political concessions that would restore alien control over human territories. Marcus realized that conventional intelligence operations wouldn't be effective against this kind of economic warfare. The Union's leadership was too distributed, their operations were too legitimate to expose as conspiracies, and their long-term strategy was too subtle to trigger the kind of dramatic responses he had used against military and scientific targets. Instead, Marcus decided to use the Union's own economic strategies against them. He had studied their trade networks extensively and identified crucial bottlenecks where the Union depended on resources from specific systems or trade routes. By carefully timing the release of information about these dependencies to the Union's economic competitors, Marcus could trigger market responses that would disrupt their carefully planned economic campaigns. The operation required patience and precise timing. Marcus arranged for the Union's competitors to learn about profitable trade opportunities just as the Union was preparing to enter new markets. He ensured that key resource suppliers received better offers from alternative buyers exactly when a Union needed to secure long-term contracts. Most importantly, he provided human colonies with information about Union pricing strategies, allowing them to develop more effective counteroffers and alternative supply sources. The Economic Union found itself fighting an increasingly expensive trade war against competitors who seemed to anticipate their moves with uncanny accuracy. The Union's leadership concluded that they were facing a coordinated intelligence operation by multiple hostile factions, but they couldn't identify the source of the leaks or determine which competitors were working together against them. As the three major neo-imperial factions struggled with their respective crises, Marcus began implementing the final phase of his strategy. He had realized that simply defeating immediate threats wasn't sufficient for long-term human security. The galaxy was full of aggressive species that would eventually target human colonies once they recovered from current conflicts or developed new capabilities. Marcus needed to create a permanent deterrent effect that would discourage future threats without requiring constant intelligence operations to maintain. The solution lay in the reputation that humanity would develop from the mysterious collapse of the HFY Empire and the subsequent failures of neo-imperial factions. By carefully managing the flow of information about these events, Marcus could create the impression that humanity possessed sophisticated intelligence capabilities and defensive technologies that made them too dangerous to attack. The key was ensuring that potential enemies learned enough about human capabilities to be deterred, without revealing enough to allow them to develop countermeasures. Marcus began releasing selected information about the Empire's collapse through channels that would reach other hostile species. The information was presented as intelligence reports from various sources, making it appear that multiple organizations had independently discovered evidence of human involvement in the Empire's destruction. The reports didn't claim that humans had single-handedly destroyed the Empire, which would have been too unbelievable to be effective. Instead, they suggested that human intelligence agencies had identified and exploited existing weaknesses in the Imperial system, using sophisticated psychological operations to accelerate natural tensions between factions. The implications were terrifying for any species considering aggression against humanity. If humans could bring down the galaxy's most powerful empire by understanding and manipulating their enemy's psychology, what could they do to smaller, less sophisticated opponents? The deterrent effect was enhanced by the continued failures of neo-imperial factions, which appeared to confirm that humans possessed ongoing intelligence capabilities. Other species began to wonder if their own organizations were vulnerable to the same kind of sophisticated manipulation that had destroyed the HFY. Back on Europa Station, Dr. Morrison finally realized that Marcus Chun was extraordinary. His reports on alien communication patterns had evolved into comprehensive analyses of galactic political developments that were proving remarkably accurate. She recommended him for immediate promotion to senior analyst and assignment to Earth Strategic Intelligence Division. Marcus politely declined the promotion, explaining that he preferred the quiet independence of his current position. Dr. Morrison assumed he was being modest about his contributions to humanity's security during the recent galactic crisis. If she had known the complete truth, that the quiet researcher in the Forgotten Office had single-handedly dismantled the galaxy's greatest empire and was now maintaining humanity's security through ongoing intelligence operations against multiple hostile species, she would have realized she was looking at the most successful intelligence operative in human history. Marcus saved his current files and began reviewing intelligence reports about new potential threats emerging in distant star systems. The quantum hierarchies were expanding aggressively in the galactic core, while the hive worlds were showing signs of technological advancement that could pose future dangers to human colonies. The quiet human who had brought down the HFY Empire settled back into his chair and began planning his next campaign. As long as hostile species threatened humanity, Marcus Chun would be there in his Forgotten Office, watching, learning, and protecting his people through methods that his enemies would never see coming. The galaxy had learned to fear the mysterious intelligence capabilities of humanity, not knowing that their greatest threat was a single quiet man who understood that the most powerful weapon in the universe was truth revealed at exactly the right moment to exactly the right people. Marcus had proven that empires could be toppled not by superior firepower or larger armies, but by someone who understood that every tyranny contained the seeds of its own destruction and was patient enough to nurture those seeds until they grew into the forces that would bring the tyrants down.